Volume is always king. At least that's what they try to tell us. But how accurate is that? Yeah, volume is great, but should we just give up on efficiency as well? So like I do every offseason, welcome to my volume versus efficiency series, where over the next couple of weeks, I'm gonna be taking a look at some of the top performers in terms of volume at all the positions in fantasy football, and then comparing it to their efficiency. And we really try to determine, hey, should we always be shooting with the guy with volume, or should we be taking a chance on some of the guys who have great efficiency as well? Yo, what is going on, Headliner Nation? Today's video is super exciting because it kicks off my volume versus efficiency series that I do every single off season. And over the next couple of weeks, I'm going to be breaking down all the positions in fantasy football and talking about volume versus efficiency and what we really need to be looking for, and are there any statistics that we should be keeping an eye on when we do our fantasy football drafts. I really feel like these videos give you the upper hand when it comes to drafting. Another thing that's going to give you the upper hand is becoming a member here on YouTube of the Fantasy Headliners and getting access to our exclusive Discord community, where you'll not only have an opportunity to connect with Jake, myself, and the other members of the Fantasy Headliners team, but other members of Headliner Nation as well. Talk about player values, trade ideas, look for leagues to play in. Maybe you want to pick up an extra league this season. There's a lot of people in our Discord that would be willing to start one up with you. But overall, it's just a great community where you can connect with a ton of people that love sports. If you're interested in getting into our Discord, become a member here on YouTube, click the join button down below me, pick any of the 3 tiers, and you'll get access to our Discord immediately, plus some other perks as well. But today, we're going to be talking about running backs, and all the players that we'll have listed today are going to be guys that had at least 200 carries in 2023. But not only are we going to break down carries, but we're going to be breaking down a ton of volume statistics that we need to be taking into consideration. And then at the end of the video, we're going to average everything out, and we're going to take a look at who is really the king of volume and see if there's any surprises that we should keep in mind heading into 2024 drafts. So hit that like button, subscribe if you're new here. Let's go ahead and take a look at rushing attempts from 2023. 280 rushing attempts. And I know that there's some people out there that really feel like Derrick Henry is coming towards the end of his career. But if the dude was able to run the ball 280 times last season and be just fine in Tennessee, imagine what he could do while he's in Baltimore. And maybe he doesn't get 280 carries this year. Maybe they only give him 250. But just think how much better he could be with even a few less touches. And I think a lot of people know that Rachaad White got quite a few carries last season, but to see him right next to Christian McCaffrey, I think may throw some people off as well. And Rachaad White really is the perfect example of why I started doing this series. And we'll be talking about him quite a bit over the next couple of weeks because his volume stats are absolutely tremendous. But when we jump over to efficiency, that's where things are going to get a little weird. And I don't think it surprises anybody to see guys like Najee Harris, Joe Mixon, even Travis Etienne here at the top of this list. But maybe a guy like James Cook surprises you a little bit, or even Chuba Hubbard. Both guys who were inside the top 10 in terms of carries last season, but now have some rookie running backs that they may lose some touches to. But again, how many touches do they lose actually ends up hurting their fantasy value enough that they should drop or even be passed on. And then you look at the bottom of the list and you really appreciate how good Raheem Mostert was last season, because this guy was barely inside 200 carries last season and was one of the top running backs in all of football. Once again, another reason why I started doing this series, right? Because it's going to be interesting to see where he lands in terms of volume, but we already know by looking at it, he was a stud last season, so his efficiency must have been crazy. All right, let's go ahead and move over to rushing yards. And I don't have yards per attempt in this video because it's not a volume statistic. It is, however, something to still look at because we just talked about rushing attempts. So let's take a look at some of the biggest fallers from from rushing attempts over to rushing yards. And this is where talking about a guy like Travis Etienne again is going to come into place, because last season he tied for second in rushing attempts. But then when you take a look at the stats on the screen, he's fallen all the way down to 14th in rushing yards. Now there's a couple of other guys that took a little bit of a tumble as well. Travis Etienne is one of them. Now at the beginning of the season, he was a little bit better. Towards the middle and back half of the season, when he started to have some issues dealing with injuries and the offense as a whole just wasn't functioning very well, he saw some of his yards per attempt start to drop and drop and drop. But for Rachaad White, he didn't deal with injuries last season, and his offense all season long was actually firing on all cylinders. So we need to start looking at, why was Rachaad White just so bad in terms of those little efficiency areas like yards per attempt, where other guys excelled at that? Because when you take a look at the top 6 guys in terms of rushing yards, 4 of those players were actually 10th or lower in rushing attempts. Kyren Williams, James Cook, DeAndre Swift, James Conner, all these guys didn't get as many carries as some of the other running backs last season, but they did a whole lot more with a whole lot less. And sometimes that is absolutely okay. And you would have to think a guy like Saquon Barkley, who was 8th in rushing attempts but 16th in rushing yards last season, would also see a nice prop up in his efficiency this coming year. All right, let's move over to rushing touchdowns. And this is an area that I tell people not to chase consistently, right? Because rushing touchdowns are something that can fluctuate every single season. In fact, in a video I did last week where I talked about bold predictions, we took a look at some guys like Travis Kelce at the tight end position, who every other year scores double-digit touchdowns. It's just weird to chase touchdowns sometimes, because one year you'll have a lot of them, and then the next year maybe you don't get as lucky. Maybe your team isn't inside the 5-yard line as much. We see that sometimes with running backs too, where their team, maybe their offense just isn't as efficient in the red zone, and because of that they don't score as many touchdowns as we would like. And 3rd in the league last season with 13 rushing touchdowns is David Montgomery. And this is one of the reasons why I feel like David Montgomery and Jahmyr Gibbs will continue to excel in the Lions backfield and can both be drafted as fantasy starters. Now, Jahmyr Gibbs is not popping up in this video because he did not reach 200 carries to get inside this video, but that doesn't mean that he's still not a good fantasy draft pick for this coming year, because efficiency-wise, he absolutely dominates in some areas. But that's also another reason to look at this video and say, yeah, while Jahmyr Gibbs may be a really good fantasy pick, David Montgomery's no slouch either. And maybe just because he doesn't reach some of the efficiency areas that we don't want him to, it doesn't mean that the volume he gets in key situations won't be enough to keep him fantasy viable. Now, should we look at him as a running back 1? No. Should we draft him as a running back 2? Probably not. But if you can draft him on your team as a guy that you can use as like an RB3 or flex option, that's where you find the value in terms of some of these guys with their volume. And there are some guys who finished really low on this list that I feel like are going to have a bump up in terms of their touchdowns this season, just because, are you really going to be able to keep them out of the end zone as much as you did last year? For as good as James Cook was last season, he just couldn't find the end zone. Only 2 rushing touchdowns. Bijan Robinson used a top 10 pick on him and he only scored 4 times on the ground. That is 100% changing this year. Saquon Barkley and Josh Jacobs, each of them had 6 rushing touchdowns last season, but they're in much better situations now than they were a year ago. All right, what about red zone carries? This is an area that I definitely like to keep an eye on, because these are the type of high leverage carries that will give you more scoring opportunities. But it's also a good way to determine, hey, some of these running backs that don't have a lot of rushing touchdowns, are they even given the opportunity to score as much as their peers? Now, I think it's no surprise to everybody that Christian McCaffrey McCaffrey is the top of the list. But what about Tony Pollard? Utilized inside the 20 quite a bit last season. Now, he was misused overall by Dallas because he just was not utilized the way that he should be and the way his game translates to the NFL. But if he can stay with this type of usage inside the red zone with Tennessee, he could end up seeing some of his value come back up as long as we don't overdraft him. And I'm sorry, but Kyren Williams being 4th inside the red zone in terms of touches among running backs last season shows why he was such a great fantasy asset last season. This is a guy that even with Blake Corum on the team this year is still going to be heavily utilized. Sean McVay typically doesn't deploy a 2 running back system. Blake Corum's going to get touches, and if something happens to Kyren Williams, Blake Corum is a great backup, but Kyren Williams is still the dude. But a minute ago, we talked about a guy like James Cook and Bijan Robinson, and let's go ahead and add Breece Hall to that conversation as well, because all 3 of these running backs were not really utilized in the red zone last season, and that is somewhere that we need to see a higher uptick in terms of their usage to more consistent fantasy production. Now, when you take a look at Bijan Robinson and James Cook, both of these guys in terms of where they were drafted last season probably didn't really meet your expectations. Breece Hall did. But when you take a look at what Breece Hall did all last season, there were some up and downs in his game. With Aaron Rodgers back this season and hopefully being utilized in the red zone a lot more often, could bring him some more consistent fantasy production, but also help him reach another level that he just didn't quite find at times last year. All right, here is where we get into the nitty gritty. Goal line carries inside the 5-yard line. This is where we find out, hey, is a guy just not getting the opportunities, or is he getting the opportunities and he's just not good enough to punch it into the end zone? And that's where you wonder if a guy like Joe Mixon was just held back by his offensive line too many times last season. Number 1 in the league in goal line carries, but only number 7 in rushing touchdowns. Now, it's no secret. The Cincinnati offensive line has struggled for the last few years, as Cincinnati just has not been able to address that issue. With being in Houston now and having tons of weapons around him still, but also possibly a little bit better of an offensive line, does he take advantage of some of those goal line carries more often this season? Also, Tony Pollard, number 5 in goal line carries last season, but 12th in rushing touchdowns. In Dallas's offensive line was pretty good last season. It did deal with some injuries here and there, but overall, it was not one of the worst offensive units in football. Tennessee's offensive line was not great, and they are taking steps to address that offensive line and did once again this season. So hopefully it's a lot better. And if Will Levis is really the guy in Tennessee and he's able to throw the deep ball the way he did last season, it could open up some things for Tony Pollard. But Tony Pollard is not a guy that you hand the ball to and just ask him to run up the middle a whole lot. So maybe it's not really the goal line carries that it's the issue in terms of not being able to punch it in. Maybe he's just not that type of running back, and Tennessee goes with Tyjae Spears a little bit more often. Now, when people talk about DeAndre Swift, they're like, hey, wait a second, Jalen Hurts took a lot of his goal line carries. It's not DeAndre Swift's fault, it's the Philadelphia Eagles. No. DeAndre Swift last season was 9th in goal line carries. The guy saw plenty of goal line carries. He was 16th in rushing touchdowns. So for the Chicago Bears this season, this is one of the reasons why I'm just not all on DeAndre Swift, because if he doesn't get better at getting it into the end zone, because let's face it, Philadelphia's offensive line last year was one of the best in the NFL. Are we so sure that he's going to be able to punch it in behind the Chicago Bears offensive line? Travis Etienne last season was 11th in rushing attempts inside the goal line, but he scored double-digit touchdowns. He scored 11 touchdowns. He was one of the more efficient running backs last season when you took a look at being able to score from inside the 5 in terms of how many touches he actually got there. All right, now we're moving over to the passing game, because when you talk about volume, you need to include how much work these running backs are getting in the passing game as as well. And here at the top of the list, it's not going to surprise you to see a guy like Breece Hall and Bijan Robinson so high. And of course, Christian McCaffrey at number 3 is no surprise either, but Travis Etienne and Rachaad White inside the top 5 in terms of targets may catch you a little off guard. Now, both of these guys had a ton of volume last season, and it is fair to say that maybe these guys are going to see a little bit of a step back. The Tampa Bay Buccaneers spent a draft pick on Bucky Irving, who does a pretty decent job as a pass catcher. Rachaad White could end up losing some of those pass catching opportunities to him. Travis Etienne, Doug Peterson has already made comments that he does want to dial back the volume a little bit for Travis Etienne this season because he wants to keep him healthier all year long. But I want to take a second to talk about Jerome Ford as well. Now, a lot of you know that I hated on him quite a bit last season, and I wouldn't even say, hey, I just kept trying to paint a picture for you all that was more realistic than what a lot of people thought it was with Jerome Ford. He did great at times, but at other times he really left you hanging, and a lot of people felt like he was this league winner that was picked up after Nick Chubb went down, and he really wasn't. But he could have a place in our fantasy lineups this year because we don't know about Nick Chubb as of yet. The hope is that he'll be back for week 1, but if he's not, Jerome Ford is probably going to see a few touches. But Jerome Ford may not be a bad draft pick this season, even if Nick Chubb is expected back earlier in the year, because he did decent in the passing game last season. And we know Nick Chubb has never been a guy that receives a ton of targets out of the backfield. Not for a lack of being bad at it, he just never has. Jerome Ford in PPR leagues this year, and maybe even in half PPR leagues, could end up being a guy that we do draft and could see a decent amount of workload in the passing game based on what we saw last season, where, hey, if he gets a few targets here and there, especially in those situations where they're going to be trailing or playing a lot tougher teams, we could throw him into our lineup as a flex option, and because he's not going to cost us a whole lot on draft day, fingers crossed, he could be a guy that throughout the season could be utilized correctly. And then for the guys at the bottom of this list, I wouldn't necessarily pass on any of them at any of their given ADP currently. And that's something that we'll talk about way more as the offseason goes on. My only thing that I want to mention with them is that they're probably not going to be utilized a whole lot in the passing game. That doesn't mean that they can't be great fantasy producers for us. It just means that we need to be realistic of where they could end up landing in terms of an upside. Because for me, the passing game isn't really about establishing a good floor. It's about establishing an upside. Because every running back in the NFL, if you play enough snaps, is likely going to see some targets. Maybe not a ton, but they're going to see some. And that helps establish their floor with the amount of volume they're getting on the ground. It's the guys that see a ton of targets in the passing game that you really start to see a lot of upside in their game. For instance, Raheem Mostert. Tons of upside last year, but he was really, really safe. We knew on a weekly basis this was a guy that we could rely on to get us quite a bit of fantasy points, and it was based on his volume on the ground. Now, he didn't see a whole lot of work in the passing game. That's okay. It didn't affect his floor in any given week, and it really didn't affect his ceiling either. That is why sometimes when people are like, oh, he doesn't get passes, he doesn't get targets, he's not worth the upside, that you have to be a little bit more realistic with what does that actually mean. All right, I'm not gonna dive into receptions too much because when you take a look at receptions and targets, if you got a lot of targets, you typically got a lot of receptions. I mean, when you cross-match targets and receptions, everybody was within a few spots of where they landed in targets. So it's not really a whole lot to break down here. If you got a lot of targets, you probably got a decent amount of receptions as well. If you didn't get a whole lot of targets, you didn't get a whole lot of receptions. Now, for the most part, receiving yards are the same way, but there's one person in particular that I want to highlight here, and it's Javonte Williams. Now, why is that? Well, with Javonte Williams, he went from 10th in targets to 8th in receptions, but all the way down to 15th in receiving yards. And more than likely, Bo Nix is going to be the starter week 1 for the Denver Broncos. I have my concerns about Bo Nix, and that's neither here nor there for this video. However, Javonte Williams, if he is really the guy in that backfield to start, which there might be some questions about that, if we can utilize him in the passing game the same way, especially in terms of the receptions and the targets, the receiving yards this year could end up being a little bit better. Now, why were they so low? It could be the fact that the dump-offs just weren't quality dump-offs. Getting rid of the ball because the passing game just wasn't working at times last year. There was a lot of defenders in the box. Javonte Williams didn't really have an opportunity to get any open space at that point. Javonte Williams was less than a year removed from most of last season from a pretty devastating knee injury. So maybe it was his explosiveness that was lacking. Whatever it may be this season, if Bo Nix is the starter, I think Javonte Williams still has a pretty good shot to be up inside the top 10 in terms of targets and receptions. But hopefully, if this offense can take a step forward, we can see his receiving yards go up a little bit as well. And if they do, he may not be one of the worst draft picks that we could make next season. Now, again, they've got a lot of guys, and Samaje Perine could be a guy that ends up becoming a cut casualty at some point in time with Jaleel McLaughlin and also Audric Estime being drafted this past year. Now, Estime is a guy that's missing camp right now and probably will miss the rest of the summer with a knee scope, but will be ready when training camp actually opens up as we get closer to week 1 of the season. And for receiving touchdowns, just kind of back to a point that I made a couple of minutes ago with Jerome Ford. 5 receiving touchdowns is not a ton, but it was good enough to be second in the league in terms of running backs receiving touchdowns last season. So no matter what happens with Nick Chubb, Jerome Ford should be on our radar as a potential PPR option. He loses a little bit of value in half PPR leagues, but if he can get a few dump-offs next season and he can see some targets from Deshaun Watson, he absolutely becomes a guy that we could utilize in the flex spot. And I don't want to hate on Tony Pollard too much, but he was 6 in targets, 6 in receptions, and he didn't even score a receiving touchdown last year. All right, now let's take a look at our final score. And the lower the score, the better. We take all the categories that we talked about today, we average them all out, and then we get our final score to see who was the best last year in terms of volume. Now, keep in mind, this score by itself doesn't mean a whole lot, but it's going to mean a lot as we talk about these things over the next couple of weeks. Now, the leaders in terms of volume last season probably don't surprise a whole lot of people. Christian McCaffrey was at the very top. Joe Mixon was a steady fantasy asset last season. He didn't cost you a very high draft pick, and he didn't have a high ceiling last year, but he got so much volume that it kept his floor propped up, and basically every single week you really knew what you were getting from him. Rachaad White was great in terms of volume last season. We already knew that, and we talked about it last year on a continuous basis. He was getting touches on the ground. He was getting work in the passing game. Hopefully he can just be more efficient this season. Travis Etienne is not a shock to anybody. Tony Pollard may be a little bit of a shock to people that he was so high in terms of volume, because this is one of those instances where you take a look at the guys that are listed here inside the top 6. And when you see his name, he's really the only name that you look at and you were like, really, on a weekly basis, I couldn't expect anything out of this guy. Everybody inside the top 6 either had a pretty decent floor or had a higher ceiling. Tony Pollard was really the only guy in the top 6 of volume last year that, from a fantasy standpoint, every single week, you never knew what you were going to get, and you were never comfortable playing him. All right, the next 6 guys is kind of a combination of a lot of different fantasy assets that we saw last season. You got a guy like Breece Hall and Bijan Robinson. Now, at the beginning of the season, Breece Hall was the same as Bijan Robinson. Like, you knew that there was a high ceiling, but you never really knew what that floor was going to be any given week. Hall got a lot better with that at the end of the year, but those two guys were really connected when it came to inconsistencies in our fantasy lineups to start. You got a guy like Saquon Barkley and Derrick Henry. For the most part, pretty decent floors last season. We knew what we were going to be getting from these guys, and a lot of times it was, touchdown or bust. They might have an okay floor if they don't score a touchdown, but if they got the touchdown, the ceiling got a little bit better. James Cook, we talked about his volume across the board was great. It was the touchdowns that just lacked last season. And Raheem Mostert, he's like a lot of us average Joes out there, right? He did a whole lot with maybe not nearly as much as we would have liked. All right, the next group of guys really defined players that we could expect to give us some upside on any given week, but we didn't really know what to expect. DeAndre Swift and Najee Harris, kind of synonymous with Yeah, they're getting a decent amount of volume, but where's the upside on any given week? Isaiah Pacheco, a guy that if Kansas City was in a great position and they were winning, he was going to run the football. But if Kansas City was throwing a whole lot that week, he just wasn't going to reach the ceiling that we would like. David Montgomery, a guy that's probably a little bit more touchdown dependent than we would like, but we know he's in a really good offense that's going to give him an opportunity to score. And Kenneth Walker, his volume stats were really hurt more by the fact that he dealt with some injuries last season. And these guys at the bottom, I'm going to withhold any type of analysis on, because these are the guys right here that is going to be really interesting to see what the difference is from their volume score to their efficiency score, because that's when things get a little bit more on the crazy side, because there might be guys that we take a look at and we can't rely on for a ton of volume, but efficiency wise, they're really, really good. And because they're so good efficiency wise, we know on a weekly basis, we're going to have a shot at a pretty decent upside, even if the floor is a little bit scary, because they're not going to be getting those consistent touches. So this is definitely one series that you want to keep coming back for over the next couple of weeks. Running back volume is this video today. Then on Wednesday, we're going to have wide receiver volume, and on Friday it's tight end volume. And then next week we're following the same schedule, but with running back efficiency on Monday, wide receiver efficiency on Wednesday, and tight end efficiency on Friday. And next week we'll wrap it all up, we'll see what the big differences are, and we'll use that to analyze the guys that we should really be taking a shot on this coming season, and if their status has changed whatsoever. But for now, Headliner Nation, I'm gonna get out of here. Don't forget to subscribe, potentially become a member today, and turn on those bell notifications. Anytime we go live or drop new content, you'll know about it right away. And if you've missed one of our last videos, YouTube's probably gonna recommend it to you right now. Make sure you check it out right after this video is done. Peace out, Headliner Nation. Stay safe and healthy, and I'll catch you all on the next episode of the Fantasy Headliners.